Most profit in construction doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It doesn't vanish because of a bad estimate or a lawsuit or a market collapse. It bleeds out quietly across the life of a project in a dozen small moments that each seemed too minor to formalize. The client is walking through the house with the electrician. They point at the ceiling and ask if that fixture could move 6 inches to the left. The electrician says, sure, no problem. 20 minutes of work. It happens, and everyone moves on. A week later, that client mentions to the project manager that it would be great to have an outlet on the other side of the island. The PM takes a note, tells the electrician, gets it done. The cabinet supplier calls with a lead time problem on one of the upper cabinet sizes. You substitute a different size that works spatially but requires a small design revision and a return trip from the trim carpenter to adjust the blocking. Welcome back to Brickonomics, the business of building. I'm your host, Nick Scroggs, and none of these feel like change orders. Each one is a conversation, a quick fix, a problem solved. Each one is the kind of responsiveness that builds your reputation. And at the end of the job, when the numbers don't add up the way that they should, you trace the gap back and find 20 moments just like these. Each one small, none of them documented, and all of them absorbed. That's where your margin went. Most builders think that change orders exist to get paid for additional work, and yes, that's part of it. But the deeper purpose of a change order is something that most builders have never been taught. A change order is not a payment request, it's a contract update. Its job is to keep four things aligned when reality diverges from the original plan: scope, cost, time, and risk. Most builders manage the cost piece. The other three are where the money actually disappears. Before we get into any stories, I want to address the misconception that stops a lot of builders from taking change orders seriously on every project. The belief goes something like this: change orders really matter on fixed price contracts because that's where you're on the hook for the cost overruns. On Cost Plus, the client pays actual costs anyway, so change orders are mostly administrative. The work gets done, the bill reflects it, and everyone moves on. That belief is fundamentally incorrect, and it's costing Cost Plus builders real money and headache. The purpose of a change order is not just to capture costs, it's to document the consequences of a decision. When a client decides to move a wall, change a cabinet line, upgrade their windows, or add built-ins that weren't in the original scope, they're not simply changing the scope and costs. They're changing the schedule, they're changing resource allocation, they're changing project sequencing. They're changing the assumptions that the original contract was built on. Without a change order on a cost plus job, the client may understand that the work costs more, but they almost universally assume that the end date doesn't move. They assume that the carrying costs of the projects don't increase. They assume the impact on the other trades is minimal. They make those assumptions because no document has told them otherwise, and when reality shows up differently, they feel surprised even if every individual conversation was had. The key insight is this: a change order on a cost plus job isn't primarily about getting paid for the work. It's about getting a signature that confirms the client understood the full consequences of their decision before that decision was executed. Without that signature, the consequence becomes a dispute, and disputes on cost plus jobs are some of the most frustrating in construction because the builder did the work. They billed the cost honestly, and they still end up in a conflict over something that should have been documented from the start. One of the most common ways undocumented changes happen doesn't involve the builder at all. It involves the client and a subcontractor having a conversation that you actually weren't a part of. Here's how that plays out. The client is in the house while the electrician is working. They've been thinking about an outlet location that they wish was different. The electrician is right there. Moving it would only take them a few minutes, so they ask. The electrician, wanting to be helpful and wanting to build goodwill with the homeowner, says yes. Neither of them thinks to call you first. This has happened to us more than once. Clients would approach subcontractors directly. Move this fixture, add this outlet, adjust this detail, and the sub would accommodate the request without routing it through our office. The work would get done. The PO that we had issued wouldn't cover it, and when the subcontractor's invoice came in, over the authorized amount, we were left reconstructing a change order for work that we didn't scope, didn't price, and didn't approve. Then we'd present that cost to the client, the cost of the work that they had requested, and they'd dispute it. Not because they didn't ask for the work, but because they hadn't agreed to a price before it was done. And now they felt like they were being surprised with a bill for something that they thought was minor. The work was already in the walls. There's no reversing it, so the dispute had to be resolved in some other way, and it almost always took longer and created more friction than the original scope change ever warranted. This forced two changes in how we operate. First, we added explicit language to our client contracts. All scope change requests go through the project management team. Clients are not to communicate work requests directly to subcontractors. If a client has an idea while a trade is on site, they have to bring it to us. We scope it, we price it, we write the change order, get the approval, and then direct the sub to do the work. Second, we added language to our subcontractor agreements. If they perform work on one of our projects without a purchase order authorizing that work, they're performing it at no charge. The PO is their authorization. Anything outside of it requires our approval before they proceed. These two changes together close the loop. The client knows the process, the sub knows the consequences of bypassing it, and every scope change, however minor, has to be documented before the work starts. The broader principle is this: every undocumented change order creates risk. When work happens without a change order, regardless of who requested it, the consequences fall on whoever didn't document it, and in construction, that's almost always the builder. Of all the ways builders lose margin on change orders, time is the most insidious because it's invisible in the moment. You price the additional work, you write it up, you get the signature, and you feel like you've handled it. But if you didn't add days to the project timeline, you've only handled half of the change. We learned this on a large-scale home remodel. It was a significant project to begin with: complex scope, multiple trades, a lot of moving parts, and over the course of the build, the client added to it continuously. New built-ins here, an expanded outdoor living space, a bathroom that grew in complexity from what was originally planned, a kitchen that gained features as decisions got made. By the end of the project, the client had added as much additional work as was in the original contract. The scope had effectively doubled. But the project end date in the client's mind had never moved. Every change order had been written. The costs were captured. We had gotten signatures on the pricing, but we hadn't attached a specific number of additional days to each change. And because we hadn't, the project time frame in the client's mind was still anchored in the original completion date that they had signed at the start. We were having the conversations. Every time a change came through, we would tell them verbally that it would add approximately some number of days to the project. They would acknowledge it, and in the moment, they understood. However, clients seem to have selective amnesia when they're ready to be done with a construction project in their home. When the original end date arrived and the project wasn't complete, the verbal updates that we had given about the additional time had largely vanished from memory. What remained was the completion date on the original contract and a house that still had trades in it. The dispute that followed was painful and time-consuming in a very specific way. We had to go back through every single day on the project calendar and reconstruct, change order by change order, the days that had been added by each approved scope change. We built a timeline document from scratch that we should have been building all along, one signed document at a time as each change was approved. From that point forward, every change order includes a specific number of additional calendar days on every contract type and every single time. The client signs that number alongside the costs. It's no longer a verbal update that can be misremembered. It's a document that exists in the project record. This also back connects directly to the margin problem of carrying costs. Every additional day a project runs costs money that has nothing to do with productive work happening on that day. Dumpsters on a weekly or monthly rental cycle, portable toilets that bill by the week, rented equipment that charges by the day. These costs don't care whether anyone is swinging a hammer. They run on calendar time, not on work time. If a change order adds 8 days to the project but doesn't include it in the daily conditions cost for those 8 days, you're absorbing the carrying cost of your client's decisions out of your own margin. Not because you made a mistake, but because you didn't document the full consequence of the change at the time it was approved. The rule we operate on: if it adds time, the time goes in the change order. If the time adds carrying costs, the carrying costs go in the change order. The client approved the change. The client approved the consequences. Both need to be in writing. Most change orders builders use include one thing: the cost of the additional work. Materials, labor, subcontractors. That's the direct cost of the change, and it's necessary, but it's not enough. A complete change order has 5 components, and if any one of them are missing, the change order is incomplete, and the piece that's missing is usually where the margin loss happens. First are your direct costs: materials, labor, and subcontractor costs specific to the change. This is what most builders include and where most builders stop, and it's a starting point, but not the finish line. Next are your administrative costs, which for us are supervision and estimating fees. Every change order takes time for your team to put together and manage, therefore, every change order needs to have administrative costs. We price supervision as a percentage of the total cost of the change, the same way that it's priced in the original contract. Not as a daily rate, not as an hourly charge, but as a percentage of the total cost. The reason for this structure is important. If we price supervision as a daily rate, every change order conversation would potentially become a negotiation about how many days of supervision the change actually requires. That's not a conversation that we want to be having all the time, and it creates a pervasive incentive to limit supervision time on a change scope to avoid the appearance of padding the bill. Pricing it as a percentage means that it scales naturally with the complexity and cost of the change. A significant scope addition carries a significant supervision fee. A minor adjustment carries a minor one. The math is transparent and consistent with how the original contract was priced. The third item all change orders need is daily conditions: dumpsters, portable toilets, temporary power, rented equipment. Price for the additional days the change order adds to the project. The explanations to clients is simple. These items don't negotiate with the calendar. Every additional day the project runs, these costs runs with it. The change added days, therefore these days have a cost, and that cost belongs in the change order. Most clients accept this immediately once it's explained. It's not a complex concept. A dumpster that's been on the job site for an extra week because the project ran longer due to approved changes. The client understands intuitively that somebody has to pay for that week. The change order just makes it explicit who that is. Fourth, any design-related fees. For design build companies, this is one of the most commonly missed components. Changes often require design work before the physical work can happen: a layout revision, a selection change that requires new drawings, engineering coordination for a structural modification, or interior design work to respecify finishes. That work has a cost. It happens before a single trade goes on to site, and it belongs in the change order, not as a favor to a client, but as an accurate accounting of what the change actually costs to execute from start to finish. Finally, any additional calendar days. A specific number in writing with a client signature. Not an approximation, not a verbal update that gets noted in a project log. A number that the client signs alongside the costs, creating a record that it's contractually binding as the original completion date, including time that the job spent not moving while the change order was being put together. This is the component that most builders skip, and it's the one that produces the most painful disputes when the project extends beyond the date the client remembers signing for. The 5-question test for any change order: what changed? What does it cost? What additional resources does it require? How many additional days does it add? And what happens if it isn't approved? If the change order doesn't have all 5, it's incomplete. Everything we've covered so far assumes that change orders are getting written. The most expensive change orders in construction are almost always the ones that nobody writes. Can you move this? While you're here? This shouldn't take that long. Let's just swap this out. These requests happen on every project, and they feel too small to formalize. They feel like the kind of responsiveness that builds client relationships rather than the kind of thing that requires paperwork and signatures. And individually, they're often small. A few minutes of work, a $100 material substitution, a quick adjustment that takes less time to do than to document. But they accumulate. Across a project with dozens of these moments, each one absorbed without a document, a signature, or a number, you end up with real margin loss that has no single source. The project ran longer than it should have. The supervisor spent time on things that weren't in the original scope. The electrician made 3 extra trips. The trim carpenter came back twice. None of that is catastrophic, but all of it adds up. The discipline of writing up every change, including the ones that feel too small to bother with, isn't about being difficult with the clients. It's about keeping the contract aligned with reality. Even a small change has consequences. Documenting it protects both parties. The client knows what they approved and what it costs, and you have a record of what work has been authorized. The practical standard that we operate on, if it changes the scope, the cost, or the time, even slightly, it gets a change order. The size of the change order doesn't exempt it from the process. The process actually exists precisely for the small changes that seem harmless in the moment and become problems in aggregate. There's also a client relationship benefit to this discipline that most builders don't anticipate. When clients see that every scope change, however minor, generates a document that captures what's changed, what it costs, and how long it takes, they start to understand intuitively that changes have consequences. The change order process itself becomes an education in the reality of construction. Clients who go through it on a well-managed project come out of it with a much more accurate understanding of how projects evolve and why costs and schedules move. That understanding is what prevents the selective amnesia that makes end-of-project disputes so painful. Here's what I want you to take away from this episode. Most builders think that profit is lost through bad estimates, bad contracts, or major mistakes, and sometimes it is, but more often it disappears much more quietly than that. One undocumented scope change that the client didn't think needed a change order. 1 week of dumpster and supervision costs absorbed because the change order captured the work, but not the time. One project that ran 6 weeks past its original end date because the additional days were communicated verbally, but never signed for. One electrician who did 3 extra trips because a client asked him directly and he wanted to be helpful. None of these are dramatic. None of them feel like a crisis when they happen, but across a year's worth of projects, they represent real money. Money that was earned, that your business deserved, that simply wasn't captured because the process wasn't in place to capture it. A completed change order includes direct costs, supervision fees, daily conditions, design fees, and additional calendar days with the client's signature. It's not bureaucracy, it's the mechanism that keeps the contract aligned with reality as the project evolves, and that alignment is what protects both parties. The client knows exactly what they approved and what it's going to cost them, and you have a record that every consequence of every decision was understood and agreed to before the work was done. When that documentation exists, disputes don't start from conflict, they start from a shared record. When it doesn't, they start from two people who remember the same project very differently. The original contract is built on assumptions. Change orders are what happen when reality shows up. In the next episode, we're closing out the Contracts and Risk series with a conversation about risk, liability, and sleeping at night. You now understand how to structure a contract, protect your cash flow, and preserve your margin through the change order process. The next question is how to think about the broader risk landscape, the exposures that most builders carry without fully understanding them, and the systems that let you run a construction business without carrying that weight on your shoulders every day. Thanks for listening to Brickonomics, and I'll see you in the next one.